Fairness, a concept that our society treasures, something that we as law enforcement officers value. Americans plan and prepare for their retirement years by investing into retirement benefits. But for millions of public employees, policemen, firemen, teachers, and others, that planning means that if you've paid into both the public pension system and have met your necessary quotas to qualify for Social Security, you will be penalized. Although you paid for these benefits, the Social Security rules could result in a reduction of your Social Security benefits. The windfall elimination provision, known as WEP, and the government pension offset, known as GPO, in the current Social Security law cuts or eliminates the earned benefits for more than 2 million retirees. This provision has created a very real inequity for many public employees, particularly law enforcement officers, who retire at an earlier age than other government employees due to the demands placed on them both physically and mentally. And often they begin a second career. This provision cuts as much as 60% of their Social Security benefits, a benefit that they paid for just as every other American. Keeping what you earn and deserving nothing if it's not earned, that's fair. One of the FOP's top priorities is H.R. 82, the Social Security Fairness Act, which would repeal windfall elimination provision and government pension offset. This is an issue of fairness, as these public employees are unfairly penalized under current law. It is critical to have strong allies in Congress, especially those working to address the most pressing issues facing America's law enforcement community. Today we're joined by one of the leading sponsors of this bill, Representative Rodney Davis from Illinois' 13th Congressional District. Representative Davis has been fighting for the men and women in blue since day one. This is the Blue View. Congressman Davis, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for your support for law enforcement. You've been consistent, one of the most consistent in supporting the men in blue, men and women in blue. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, Mr. President, thanks for having me on. First of all, I got to say thank you to the brave men and women who are members of the Fraternal Order of Police nationwide who go out and protect this great nation. I cannot believe some of my colleagues here in Washington that they have an idea of defunding our police. I said from day one when I heard that it's the dumbest idea I've ever heard as a member of Congress. Now it looks like the tide's turning in favor of good men and women who are in law enforcement that do their job every day. So thank you. I'm excited to be here because I grew up in a small town. We learned respect for law enforcement. We learned that if you have a question about law enforcement, you know what you do? You get to know the people who are in charge of the police force, and you get to know people who are in charge of your community. So for me, I grew up in Taylorville, Illinois. I am in a McDonald's family. My mom and dad operated in McDonald's since I was 7, but my dad started at one in 1959 and then never left. And his dream to own one day allowed my family to achieve the American dream. So married my high school sweetheart. We have 3 kids, 25-year-old daughter and twin boys who are 21. And I'm really excited to get them all out of college in about a year and a half. So great times, great community. And I've been in Congress for the last 9 years. I'm in my 5th term. I was told I should never run for Congress. And then I was told when I won the closest Republican victory in the nation in 2012, I wasn't going to come back. So my job was to get things done. And that's what I think we've done. And that's what I think's allowed us to keep getting reelected and really work on the issues that are important to the men and women in blue.
Well, we certainly appreciate it. That explains your background and where this deep commitment comes to supporting law enforcement at small town America. So we certainly do appreciate it. You have been a staunch supporter of a number of things that are important to law enforcement. One in particular, and we'll get to that in a second. But obviously, you know, it's kind of a volatile time in Washington, especially politically. And you have a very strong record of reaching across the aisle and working and getting things done. Where does that come from?
Well, it comes from where I grew up. I mean, look, we can disagree on policy, but it doesn't mean we have to be disagreeable, and it doesn't mean we have to constantly put a red or a blue label on every solution. Look, there are things out here that we need to be doing in Washington that will positively affect all Americans, and we shouldn't put a partisan litmus test on that. I've been proud of my record. And as a matter of fact, it's a record that has allowed us to really put good conservative solutions forward. I believe some of the provisions that we're working on, some of the bills we've worked on together are very good bipartisan bills. but they're conservative solutions to problems. I was able to put together a voluntary private sector conservative based approach that allows every employer to pay down student debt for every employee. And the student or the former student who has debt is tax free gets it tax free on the first $5,250 a year. There's no grant application. All you do, if you're an employer, you want to recruit somebody, you say, do you have student debt? And if they say yes, you begin to pay their student debt for them, report what you pay them on a W-2, and that helps solve a problem. Those are the solutions that should be bipartisan. And then we get away from all the BS that we hear from some of my colleagues out here. Oh, we're just going to expunge student debt. That's never going to happen. And all it does is it encourages those who can least afford it to borrow more. So thanks for bringing up my record of working across the aisle, because I think that's what's allowed me to win tough districts and keep coming back.
You know, what you talking about working across the aisle, just it's keeping a little further with that. This is it's an election year. It's always hard to get things done in election year because elections overshadow common sense issues that really we want Congress to address. What do you think the chances are of finding that bipartisanship in this type of environment this year and getting these meaningful things done?
I will tell you, from my 16 years I spent in the district in Illinois working for another member of Congress before I got elected, and up till now, this place has never been more polarized than it is today. And I think it's a direct result of the leadership that we have in the House right now, with the smallest majority that any majority has had in a generation. The polarization helps to keep members of Congress focused on the politics versus the policy objectives. And that's something that we have to consciously work to change. And that's something that I've talked with, I call him future Speaker McCarthy, because I do believe that we will be able to convince the American people that Republicans will have a different vision and we will take over the House. I'm excited for that. And I do believe that under Speaker McCarthy, we will see a change. We will see more bipartisanship, but most importantly, we'll see more solutions get through Congress.
Well, and so if we could, let's talk about that bipartisanship. You worked with Representative Spanberger of Virginia on HR 82, something that is very near and dear to the hearts of many of my members, because it affects public employees so much. And that's Social Security, windfall elimination, government pension offset, repealing those two things. There's something fundamentally wrong here when you ask a person to pay into a system, and then when it's time to collect that very benefit that they paid for, like every other American, the fact that they were a public employee, they're going to be penalized because they, in fact, paid into a system and can't get the money they paid into. So can you tell me, in your opinion, working together across the aisle, how can we get, I know we hit a high watermark. We're at 260 co-sponsors. Our goal is to get to that 290 in order to force a hearing, so we could put real people sitting in seats in front of a hearing to talk about just the inequities and how I think the average person in America would look at that and listen to these stories and say, that just doesn't sound right. Well, it's not right. Talk a little bit about your passion for this particular bill, why it is so important, and why it's so important to Americans.
Well, it's extremely important because it's just so unfair. There are two egregious provisions that affect all of your members. It affects public employees across our entire economy. As a matter of fact, this issue was brought to my attention when I was a congressional staffer in the district office for a former member of Congress, John Shimkus. And it was brought to my attention by my former teachers. And they would talk to me about what these provisions mean when their spouse, they themselves go out and work in a different type of job that is covered under Social Security, and how unfair it was if one of those spouses passed away and he or she would be penalized. So I promised my former teachers that I would do something about in Washington. Now, years ago, if we would have sat here, Mr. President, and said, well, we got 260 co-sponsors, it wouldn't have meant much other than, yeah, everybody's supporting this. But keep in mind, this fix has been needed since the 80s. Yeah. And we have had majorities in the House and the Senate of Republicans and Democrats in the White House. And what has not happened? This has not been fixed. So it's a bipartisan failure.
he's gonna have even a trouble trying to get a hearing on it. And
It
just
has been.
there's enough co-sponsors to suggest it would easily pass if it just came to a vote, but it seems to be stuck in this place for since 1983.
Right.
We recognize this problem exists, and there are a couple of million uh, people who are affected by this inequity. It's I was explaining it to someone the other day and trying to put it in simple terms. It's like going to the grocery store and buying a loaf of bread. You're paying full price for that loaf of bread, but when they find out that you are a public employee, they open it up and they take as much as 60% of it away. There's something just doesn't seem right about that whole measure about it being there. And Representative Spanberger sent a letter to Speaker Pelosi and McCarthy, um, asking for this to move forward for a hearing. Have you gotten any response?
We have not, and that's what I was getting at. It's been a bipartisan lack of pushing this issue forward to make that solution. I love the way you describe this because it's exactly the case. You've paid into Social Security in many cases as a spouse or in a second career outside of public service, and you're penalized. And this passed back in the 80s under the guise of saving Social Security. Well, saving Social Security on the backs of our men and women in blue is not a solution that when I was 13, if I'd have known it was happening, I probably would have said something. But now, just like I didn't get a chance to ask about tax reform in 1986, the last time that Congress passed major tax reform. Well, I'm in Congress now. I fixed it. I changed it. We passed major tax reform. Right now, we are in a better position than we've ever been because we have a new rule that can go beyond our leadership on both sides of the aisle. And that is if we get to 290 co-sponsors, 290, we are only 30 away because of what Josh Gottheimer and Tom Reed did in negotiating a rules package just a few years ago. It forces Speaker Pelosi to put this on the floor. And then we're going to see who supports it and who doesn't. But we really need the help of the FOP to get those extra 30 to co-sponsor this bill so we can force this vote.
Well, we're working it. We're working it as hard as we can, and certainly our members are very much engaged. I was telling you earlier before we started this that the world could be on fire, and I will still get 10 emails from our members wondering when we're going to fix Social Security windfall elimination. It is such an important topic for so many of our members, and the whole concept of getting what you earned, it shouldn't be foreign to anyone. You're asking it, not asking. You're requiring public employees to pay into a system that they know that the system is rigged against them. So there's something very, very unfair about that. So I applaud you. I appreciate all that you can do to work across that aisle.
We are going to work with you and your members to identify if their member of Congress is not a co-sponsor of this bill yet. And it would be great if local police officers would sit down with that member of Congress and give them the firsthand explanation as to why these provisions need to be changed. And then if that member of Congress has a question, have he or she call me, call Abigail Spanberger. We'll sit down and explain to them how important it is to change these egregious provisions.
Well, again, thank you for leading the charge on this. I worked with Representative Graves as well. He's actually I live in his district and appreciate all of the work that you're doing trying to push this issue. It is very, very important to our members. And even during COVID, when all of the packages were coming out and trying to stimulate, trying to help those, we argued that why don't you just give some of our most vulnerable populations, our retirees, just give them their own money. Now let's fix it. Fix it when all of these things were passing through Congress. I thought that might have been a great opportunity to fix this inequity right there. Yet still here we are talking about something that there's very few people will tell you that they don't recognize it as a problem. We just can't seem to find a fix with it. So I appreciate you leading that charge. You have a few other bills that are important too. The David Dorn Back to Blue Act. Can you talk a little bit about that one as well?
Yeah, I think this is a must-pass piece of legislation too, and it's a way for us to tell our men and women who protect and serve every day that don't listen to the rhetoric that you hear coming from the far left. Don't listen to the TV news that it's okay to defund their job. This is going to reinvest in our men and women who protect us. And it would allow for It would allow for local cities to get federal dollars to be able to raise the salaries of our men and women in law enforcement to 110% of what the average salary would be in a local community or in that service area. It would also ensure that we protected our police, that we ensured that we're able to make sure that our cops get the equipment that they need. I mean, it's not just about having personnel. You got to have the equipment to do your job. And let me tell you something, Mr. President, I wouldn't be here today without the brave, well-trained Capitol Police officers who ran toward gunfire on a baseball field a few years ago so that me and my friends could run away from gunfire. I saw what well-trained officers do in a time of extreme danger. And that is something I will never forget. And it made me even more supportive of those men and women who are just as brave everywhere we see throughout this great country.
Yeah. It's law enforcement officers across this country. Some 800,000 of them suit up and show up every single day in going communities across this country and provide that, I guess, the cornerstone of a free society, the protection, the feeling safe within your own homes and your own neighborhoods. And do we have areas of this country that are struggling? And no doubt, this is why we're here. Our job is to try and improve the criminal justice system as we go along and provide that safety. But there's another crisis that has happened. I focus less on how we got here because I think we know how we got here, the demonization of law enforcement by so many public officials. But what I'm more concerned in is how do we move forward at this point? History will record those, this time and how we got here. But the reality is that doing anything less than finding a path forward and to prove the quality of life and make our community safer and our job safer is really what's the most important at the end of the day. But I see a crisis looming. This crisis is growing, and I think this bill plays a big part into it. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. That crisis is that we're losing law enforcement officers at a pace that is so much higher than we've ever witnessed before. And what we're also seeing is the best and the brightest not picking law enforcement as a profession. And so we're seeing we're going to have a serious manpower shortage that, in my opinion, is probably going to last a half of a decade. If they flipped the switch today and said, let's hire and fill all of these vacancies we have in law enforcement agencies across this country, hey, qualified candidates for every single one of them. If you flip that switch, you're still looking 4 or 5 years before you have a quality law enforcement officer through training and everything else before they become effective. So when you have so much experience leaving and so little coming up, to fill that gap of the best and the brightest, we have a crisis developing in law enforcement. We really do need to wrap our arms around this and find some bipartisan, open, fact-based discussion on how we fix this moving forward. And this bill plays a part in it. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. This looming crisis that I see coming for law enforcement.
Well, I couldn't agree more. This is a problem right now. It's not being solved by policymakers who are in charge. I was up with the members of the Illinois Fraternal Order of Police Organizations just a few months ago with my friend John Katko in Chicago, and stories were relayed to us. 5 people in a class for the Chicago police force, which used to have a demand that greatly outweighed the number of vacancies that were available. We have to come together and recognize that it's going to take all of us to rise up and change the perception that many politicians have created that law enforcement is not a place for young men and women to make a career anymore. And Hollywood has exacerbated this problem by putting together shows that talk about the fringe bad police officers rather than what our police officers do every day to protect and to serve our communities. So we need people that are going to be a voice. They're going to stand up and be a value-added voice to what you and your membership is saying every day. And that's something that I hope changes. And I think it may have changed as the president just the other night in his State of the Union flipped the narrative that many in his party were pushing, that defunding the police is a good idea. I'm glad that they're coming back to what I would say is the common sense side. But we need to make sure that happens. We need to make sure that law enforcement is invested in. I'm blessed. I've got the Macon County, Illinois law enforcement training facility that's been funded personally by one of my constituents, Howard Buffett, in my district, where men and women from local law enforcement get great training every day to go back out into our communities. They learn that it's not just okay and a good job to be a law enforcement officer, that it's a privilege. And that's what it takes.
Yeah, we look across the country. There are clearly some cities that are struggling with increasing crime rates. And then you look at cities the same size across this country that are excelling. And really, at the end of the day, if you compare the two, what you have is you have a approach where everyone is engaged on all levels in order to be able to improve the quality of life within their communities. And a lot of these policies, rug prosecutors that fail to prosecute, all of this is adding into a very volatile time. And here we are, 18 months into this. And we see the results of it. We see that crime is rising in a lot of areas. I'm very pleased to see that a lot of leaders across this country are recognizing that we need to be more inclusive in what we're doing, and I can feel that tide changing. We still have a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
You have another bill, the Blue Line Act. Can you talk a little bit about that one? That's HR 72.
Yeah, the Thin Blue Line Act is a bill that would help to keep those criminals in jail. We need to ensure that we give law enforcement officers and good prosecutors the statutory authority to charge criminals with the crimes that they deserve to be charged for, and then put them in jail. I'm all for getting petty drug offenders who may not have given information a few years ago that the prosecutor thought they could have out of jail. But those petty drug users are out because of bipartisan work that we did under the Trump administration to take those offenders and make sure those nonviolent offenders got the treatment they need and got out of our prisons. But our prisons and our jails are there for a reason. They're for the people that are continuing to commit crimes. They're the ones that are going in and smashing and grabbing our local drugstores here in Washington, D.C. We've seen an exponential increase in violent crime and carjackings in neighborhoods right outside where we're at and in neighborhoods across this great nation. And what we're also going to do with this bill is ensure that the prosecutors can charge them with the most enforceable crime that they could have committed. But we need prosecutors that are willing to charge. And that's something you brought up. And I think the tide has turned. If you look at the last election, we saw pro defund the police prosecutors lose in places like Minneapolis. We saw the home of Chop Zone, Seattle, Washington, elect a Republican district attorney who was tough on crime. Eric Adams, the new mayor of New York City, is a former cop and ran on a tough on crime agenda. I think the tide's turning in favor of our men and women in blue. And I want to thank you and thank your membership for helping us get there, because there was a time in 2020, I felt like a lone voice in the wilderness talking about how defunding the police was the dumbest idea I've ever heard.
Yeah. No, it's taken its toll. The whole demonization of law enforcement has really had a total lack of respect for authority. And it has gone much further than just law enforcement, and we see it in virtually every aspect of society today. So yeah,
everybody gets a trophy environment that people think that their feelings matter more than anyone else's, and criminals don't have a conscience.
Yeah. Well, and when we take away the deterrence, when we take away the consequences for bad action, all we do is encourage more. So that's what we're seeing across this country. We truly need to get back to the rule of law and recognize that the laws are in there are in place for a reason, and that is to have society's norms and maintain a certain level of safety within our communities. And we've lost sight of that somewhere in all of the rhetoric. We need to get back to it. Last year was a very, very dangerous year for law enforcement. There were 346 officers that were shot in the line of duty in 2021. Of that, 63 were killed. I guess even more, just as equally as disturbing, is there were 103 ambush-style attacks on law enforcement officers, largely because of the color of their uniform. And that's a 115% increase from 2020. So we see a trend happening across this country where our job is becoming a lot more dangerous. Our communities are becoming more dangerous. Our jobs are becoming much more dangerous. What do you attribute this violence towards law enforcement?
I think it goes back to the rhetoric that started decades ago, that the few times law enforcement officers might have made mistakes have been that they have been used as examples to tarnish with a broad brush the great work that our men and women in law enforcement do every day. And I think it's been, I think it's been a purposeful line of attack against those like you who support law enforcement like I do. And we've seen it, as I said earlier, Hollywood screenplays, scripts on TV series, to where they want to only talk about bad instances of law enforcement interactions. You know, I serve a lot of areas in central and southwestern Illinois that we would call mini urban areas. And I go into the schools and I have gotten a question about the police and law enforcement many times when I talk to these students at all levels of education. One in particular, I remember being in Urbana, Illinois, at a high minority rate high school. And one of the kids said, "What do you think about law enforcement? How can I get a better relationship with law enforcement? We're scared." And the question I asked him is, "Do you know your local school resource officer personally? Do you know any law enforcement officers? And do you know the city council person who represents your area, who has jurisdiction over the policies of the police department and the police chief?" And I turned and I looked at the teacher and I said, "You should bring all those people in to speak to this class. That's on you. Bring them in, develop that relationship, because it's the same thing that happens out here in Congress." Because frankly, Mr. President, you know as well as I do, the majority of the American people think that we don't talk to each other out here as Republicans and Democrats, that we're constantly fighting. But when you come out and you see us interact and you see that we actually like each other, and we may disagree on things, but we'll still talk to each other and understand that we have more in common than what we don't have in common.
So true.
That's what I would encourage to our local law enforcement officers, to go out into our schools, become that human face, find that common ground, common interaction with the next generation. So that these messages that we get out of Hollywood, these messages we get from those who want to defund our police, that they're not accepted as fact by the next generation.
Yeah, so simple. Just simply having a conversation.
It is.
Talking, having a fact-based conversation with a common goal towards it. It's fine that we have different opinions. It's what makes our country strong. We're able to work through these things and come up with compromise. We've lost compromise along the way. There's very little in this world that we can't solve if we were all committed to do it, and did it in a way to where we recognize that it's everybody has an opinion, and that opinion is important in the final result. The problem is we've become so partisan, not just in politics, but in our belief system, and not a willingness to have that discussion. I've always said that there's not a whole lot we can't fix if we just committed ourselves to do it. You bring up a great point, and it all starts. It's all about those relationships. It doesn't matter really what we do, what profession we're in. At the end of the day, I think in every bit of society, every portion of society, it really comes down to those relationships we built around them. And if we just, you talk about the invitation of bringing police into schools and talk to the students and all, it really is. If we're going to get past this, it's going to be because we get past all of this, the rhetoric, and actually start building those relationships again. If you look at communities across this country where law enforcement is engaged with the public, and everyone of all aspects of the of government is all working in concert with each other, you'll find communities that thrive. We really need to get back to that. Start building those relationships, having those open discussions, find ways to improve the criminal justice system, because the very powers that we have in criminal justice and as law enforcement officers is directly related to that trust. So we need to stop tearing down, stop putting up walls, and we need to start tearing them down and moving forward. Congressman, thank you. Thank you for being such a staunch supporter of the men and women who suit up and show up every day. I'll give you the final word.
Well, I think you really hit the nail on the head of what we need to do locally to really change what's happening in our country. The polarization has had a very detrimental effect on our men and women in blue, more so than any other part of our economy and any other part of our communities. But it's going to have to start to change at the local level, because that's going to help bubble up that change that's necessary to happen at all levels of government, and even here in Washington, D.C. Continue doing what you're doing. That's my message to your members. Do what you do to protect our communities. You don't get enough thanks publicly, but we're changing that because we're working together to show that it's not about being a Republican or a Democrat. It's about solving problems and protecting our communities. Stay strong, keep doing what you're doing. And when that happens, when our communities thrive, better members of Congress come to Washington, D.C. I know that's not the case in Louisiana where you're from, where, sometimes you send good members of Congress and other times you send Garrett Graves.
Garrett's a great guy. I live in his district.
I
think
know
the world
that.
of him. He's does a great job representing
He
us.
does a great job. One of my best friends, but I would not be a good friend to Garrett without harassing him any chance I get. But it's people like Garrett. It's people like Garrett that understand that every good thing starts back home in our communities. That's why he and I are leading the charge on getting rid of these unfair provisions. We're building that consensus, but we need your help to continue to do that through your men and women that are members of the Fraternal Order Police.
Well, I hope to have Garrett in soon, and he can take a few shots at you, and we'll call it even. But I also want to thank both you and Garrett and others. Social Security windfall elimination is such a big, important issue for our members, and it's important to note that prior to COVID, we really had started making some great movement and building those numbers up, and we're at a high watermark. We have more co-sponsors now than we've ever had before, and it's because of that asserted effort of so many to make it happen. So thank you for hosting these meetings that we're having on the Hill, inviting in all the groups that are disproportionately affected by Social Security windfall elimination, and giving an asserted effort to try and make some change with it. I know that a lot of our members really appreciate the work that you do, and they would like to maybe follow you. What would be the best way to follow you on social media? Or
well, if you get on that cesspool we call social media, you can get me on Facebook at Rep Rodney Davis. You can go to Twitter. It's at Rodney Davis. If you want to find out a little bit more about me and find out about our student loan repayment program that I think can help recruit and retain new officers, go to my website at rodneydavis.house.gov. I want to hear from you. I want to know that you're with us in trying to get these co-sponsors to pass this important piece of legislation that's going to benefit so many public employees like yourselves. But I also want to know too, what are your concerns? What's happening in your community? Because we're here, Garrett Graves, all of us here in Washington, we're here to solve problems together.
Well, again, thank you for joining us today. And for those of you listening in, we appreciate you as well. The men and women listening to the issues that are so very important to the men and women who make such a difference in our communities every day across America. This is for them, talking about those important issues. So thank you and stay safe.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode of The Blue View, hosted by Patrick Yos, National President of the Fraternal Order of Police. To catch our next episode, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating and review. To get the latest from the National FOP, make sure to follow us on Twitter and Facebook at GLFOP and on Instagram at FOP National. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.